Okay. Hello.
Well,
Can you hear
good
me
morning.
now, okay? Good. Welcome everyone again to Niche Conversations. It's our 10th episode of season 2. And I'm Jessica DeWitt. I'm one of the editors here at the network in Canadian History and Environment. And today I'm joined by Nicole Seymour. You want to tell us about yourself?
Well, I'm an elder millennial, and I can barely use Instagram, so this is a whole new world for me, but it seems to be working out in the last 2 minutes.
Yeah.
So I'm associate professor of English at Cal State Fullerton. I've written a book on queer ecologies called Strange Natures, and I'm excited to talk more about it. So.
Awesome. Yeah, so in spring 2020, I organized a series called Succession, Queering the Environment. And it was really popular and continues to be some of our most popular content on the website. And you wrote the conclusion to this series, kind of bringing it together, talking about the scholarship and where the series fit into it. And it was called Black Lives, Blackbirds, and the Unfinished Work of Queer Ecologies. And so that's what we're going to be talking about today, because it's still getting, often hundreds of reads a day sometimes. So, which is pretty good 2 years following, which I think speaks to how we need more of this content. People are really hungry for it. And so I thought we'd start off with a very simple question for someone who is new to the topic. What is queer ecology?
Yeah, so I guess I would describe it in simplest terms as a conceptual framework that asks us to see how issues of sexuality and gender and issues of environment are interconnected. But it specifically takes a non-normative approach. So that's where the queer and queer ecology. So it's not just sexual ecology. So it takes a non-normative approach. And probably like the best example, kind of historical example I could give is almost 20 years ago now, Bruce Bagamiel wrote a book called Biological Exuberance. And he's a scientist, and he talks about how other scientists, specifically animal behaviorists, for instance, were really clouded by their own sort of assumptions of heteronormativity. And so assuming that heterosexuality is, not just the norm, but the natural, the predominant thing, in humans and animals. And so he has these great stories about how scientists kind of like tied themselves up in knots trying to explain the sexual behavior amongst animals. Like, oh, they must have been, there weren't any females around, or there weren't any males around, or they must have been, they were just playing or whatever, So he talks about how these biases, heteronormative biases really affect how we think about nature and the environment. Maybe more recently, a more recent example would be someone like Kara Daggett, who I believe is a political theorist, and she came up with this term, petromasculinity, to kind of capture the ways in which cis heteromasculinity is really tied up with fossil fuel cultures. So thinking about the rise in like the mega truck. Apparently there's been an explosion, at least in the US, of giant trucks over the past few years. And so those are some examples from academia. But if we think outside academia, you can kind of see queer ecological issues and readings everywhere. So I always think about the ways in which people have really turned against gender reveal parties, like on the internet, people are just dragging gender reveal parties. And I'm sure people watching have heard the examples of, I think it happened at least twice, where a gender reveal party caused like a forest fire. And, it's hilarious. It's actually horrible. But the hilarious part about it is, just the extent to which, again, not hilarious, that's not the word, but there's something interesting about how this obsession with binary gender, it doesn't just, a queer ecologist would say, it doesn't just damage humans, it actually damages non-humans in the environment. So so those are some examples that kind of capture what I would call queer ecologies.
Awesome. Yeah, and it's something that I'm fairly new to, but it's really opened up a world of thinking, and I love, I'm a queer person, and I love being able to intertwine these things that I'm learning about myself and about my community into thinking about, the environment and environmental history, and kind of, I just love how everything's connected. And this is just another instance of that, right? So when you originally wrote this post, when was it? June of 2020. That was the initial, well, I wouldn't say initial, it was the latest um, influx of protests about racial injustices and kind of a new increase in awareness about these things. And so you wrote about that in your post. And you called it the unfinished work of queer ecologies. So I thought maybe you could outline what you think this unfinished work is in relation to race.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so at that time I was thinking a lot about how queer ecologies as, again, an academic sort of framework, although it's not limited to that, that the academic sort of version of queer ecologies hadn't really been grappling with things like white supremacy and anti-Blackness and environmental injustice. And I think there's been so much that's cropped up recently that needs to be grappled with. So I'm just thinking of the ways that white supremacists have co-opted the language of extinction, or sort of used the concern around extinction. They've kind of glommed onto that and manipulated it and turned it around toward this idea of the white race is in decline and whatnot. And so I think that's kind of the pressing work we need to do right now, is interpret that and call it out when we see it. And that has been happening, just to be clear. So at the last ASLE conference, there's a lot of papers on ecofascism, which is very similar, this idea that, that people are sort of using environmental concerns to advance fascist platforms. So that so we are talking about this stuff, so that's great. But I guess I was also sort of concerned about the ways that queer ecology scholarship has historically been pretty white, myself included. So the people doing the work have been white, but also, the texts that they've been looking at have tended to be Euro-Western texts and things like that. So there's obviously a need to diversify the field, but I think more than that, there needs to be a recognition of the ways that queer ecological thought has been articulated way before we academics sort of gave this thing a name. So I'm just thinking of like Kim Tallberg's work on polyamory and indigenous communities, and the ways that she sort of links caretaking of land to an embrace of non-normative genders and sexualities. And sort of on the flip side, there's been a lot of indigenous thinkers that have reminded us how settler colonial exploitation of land goes hand in hand with the punishment of non-normative genders and sexualities. And I always tell my students when I'm trying to explain this, I'm like, Google the term missionary position, like not image, don't do an image, but just Google the term. And I mean, that to me, like that just captures it in a nutshell, just to sort of think about the ways that colonialism has been tied up with exploitation, not just of land, but of non-heteronormative peoples and practices. So I think that's something that that queer ecologies could acknowledge more. So.
Yeah, it's just pointing out how heteronormativity and white supremacy are just very much the same. They're interlinked. They're part of the same system, and they're oppressing and really, affecting the way that we look at each other and the environment and animals and everything. Right? It's all so dismantling these systems only prove to help all of us in all of these ways, right? So it's been almost 2 years, so I thought we'd wrap up with you touched on a bit with the ecofascism idea, but talk about what have been the new developments in queer ecology in the last couple of years in relation to race and other factors.
So we had a pandemic since that article was posted. So obviously there's been a lot of not just queer ecology's work, but environmental humanities work, kind of reminding us of the real roots of the pandemic. I'm thinking of Tom Van Doren's work on the root of the pandemic is in human practices like deforestation and habitat destruction. And but so we've had a lot of that, I guess, more broadly, but specifically thinking of the queer angle, there's been a lot of work on queer and trans care networks and mutual aid and sort of things that have sprung up in the pandemic in the wake of the fact that these typical support structures or historic support structures weren't available anymore. So, queer bars were shutting down, that sort of thing. And, people that needed gender affirming surgery, those surgeries were sort of labeled what do they call it, elective, like, oh, you don't have to do this actually, because the hospitals are overwhelmed. And so there's been a lot of people, I'm thinking of Magdalena Rodokirchen, for example, who are thinking about, how have queer and trans communities sort of responded to that in non-institutional ways. And then kind of connected to that, there's been some really great stuff on queer climate justice. I'm thinking of Vanessa Raditz's work, I'm blanking out, I have a terrible memory, Leo Goldsmith, Mike Mendez, and Katie Hogan, who wrote a piece for the series, the blog post series. They've been thinking about, the ways that queer communities are particularly vulnerable to disasters. So because of higher rates of homelessness, comparatively higher rates of homelessness and mental illness and so forth. And so I think people are really starting to see the intersection of climate injustice and injustice against queer folks. And Mike Mendez actually gave a great talk where he was mentioning that FEMA only, I think last year, designated LGBT plus communities as vulnerable populations. So up until that point, there was no sort of concern of, what might these populations need that's, different or unique in a natural disaster compared to other folks. And so, so I guess that's a heartening thing that people are talking about that more. So that's what I've noticed.
Awesome. Yeah, and so we're announcement. We're planning on doing session 2 in the spring. So hopefully we can tackle some of these new topics that you are discussing. Also, the first session should be an ebook soon. It's been a much longer process than I originally thought it would be, but soon it will be, and I'm hoping that will be good for people to use for teaching and other things, like a free open access resource for folks. So I want to thank you, Nicole, for joining me today, for writing the conclusion in the first place, because it was so brilliant and it tied everything together so well. And thank you for joining me today.
Yeah, and shout out to everyone watching, and of course all the that wrote, in addition to Katie. I'm not going to remember everyone's names, but go online before the book comes out online and read all the amazing queer ecology posts. So that's my plug.
Awesome. Okay. Take care. Bye.
Bye.